500 years ago that explorers from Spain brought Roman Catholicism to Florida. And it's been over 400 years that the English colony at Jamestown was settled. That Disney movie, Pocahontas, remembers those musket-wielding early immigrants to Virginia. The story of the Pilgrims seeking religious freedom was not the first, but the third wave of European immigrants seeking to settle this continent. They all had hopes. Some of them were seeking a fountain of youth or cities of gold to plunder. Others were seeking to settle a plantation of tobacco and cotton, worked by slaves imported from Africa. Yes, we must admit that slaves arrived in Jamestown 1 year before the Pilgrims came to America. That's a sobering thought. As a lifelong Congregationalist who traces this church's heritage to those 102 children, men, and women on the Mayflower, I don't want their journey for religious freedom to get mixed in with those earlier colonies, the Spaniards seeking plunder and the Virginians seeking tobacco. See, Jamestown had been named for the reigning king, for James, the famous for his English edition of the Holy Bible, the King James Version of 1611, still used to this day in many Bible Belt Christian churches. No, in the eyes of the Pilgrims, Jamestown was an outpost of England. It was a colony chartered by the king for the king's purposes, for the merchant's purposes. The Pilgrims were seeking a new world, free from the old order of things. Historian Martin Marty of the University of Chicago, longtime editor of the Christian Century magazine, in his book Pilgrims in Their Own Land, 500 Years of Religion in America, points out that the separatist Pilgrims who arrived in Massachusetts in 1620 did not have the king's permission to settle New England. 35 more Pilgrims arrived in 1621, and another 67 arrived in 1622. And even though they brought their Bibles, they even brought with them on the Mayflower a printing press on which the first book in America, the Bay Psalter, was to be published. There was, in those 3 ships, in 3 years, not one priest among them. The Pilgrims would do fine, thank you very much, without any state-sanctioned clergy. These Pilgrims were unified by their religious zeal, not necessarily by their survivals as frontier survivalists. I will point that out later in this sermon. But first, I want us to go back in the Pilgrim story to what their lives were like earlier, back in jolly old Elizabethan England and then under King James. Now, to do so, I'm going to quote from Martin Marty's book. These separatists who first came to Little Plymouth Colony were also called variously independents or Congregationalists because of their attitudes toward the Church of England and their insistence that only local authorities could rule the congregation. Theirs was a lay-led resistance movement to the priests and the bishops of both the Roman Catholicism and the Anglican Church. Church of England worship was to them, writes Martin Marty, flat idolatry. In Elizabethan England, these exiles from the official church prayed and worshipped in homes rather than in the official sanctuaries. William Bradford and other strong lay leaders taught them to think of themselves as a biblical people, bound by their covenant with their God. In their opinion, no longer should English people simply inherit their established religion. They must dare to take matters into their own hands and own the divine covenant personally. King James vowed to make these deviants conform, or, and I quote, he would harry them out of the land, or else do them worse. And yet, writes Martin Marty, they found it difficult to find a way to flee from the profane multitude that harassed them in their gatherings at the manor house of William Brewster in the village of Scrooby. That's the name for you. If you ever want to name something a good congregational name, call them Scrooby. These well-educated and somewhat prosperous people, knowing they had much to lose, put it all at risk by booking a ship onto which they sneaked one night in 1607. Someone betrayed them before they could leave for Holland and religious freedom. They tried to escape again a few months later, but only some husbands and fathers managed to elude the authorities. Their wives and children of these pesky believers were later permitted to join them in their new haven, Amsterdam. The Dutch city was tolerant of their religion, but it was so busy and it was so diverse that these English nonconformists were more at home settling in the university town of Leiden. There, William Brewster and their beloved Reverend John Robinson helped bind those separatist groups together as a congregation for the next 12 years, at which time someone proposed going to the New World. After much travail, writes Martin Marty, they left John Robinson behind as they boarded the Speedwell in Rotterdam Harbor. It was he who gave them their classic nickname, and I quote, "They knew they were pilgrims." And pilgrims they have remained ever since. As well as the classic United Church of Christ statement, John Robinson said, "There is yet more light and truth to break forth from God's word." Today we say God is still speaking. With those encouraging words, the pilgrims were sent on their journey to America. Now at this point, I would like to interrupt the sermon to sing you a song that I wrote back as part of the bicentennial celebration in 1976 at Fort McPherson, Georgia, as the Post Chapel celebrated the bicentennial year at Thanksgiving. I was the choir director at the time. They wanted something special to tell the Pilgrim story. They couldn't find it. So I said, well, I'll write it. Tom Grubo is going to narrate now for us what happened on that voyage to America as I play the piano and sing the Mayflower Passage.